Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mystery and Reason Lecture 6.2. We started doing argument evaluation by ranking the rivals, and we'll continue with that by doing another example, a pretty elaborate example to really give you a sense of how the process goes. And then we'll try to switch over to talking about investigations, which in a way has been um, something that we've been talking about as we've been going through a lot of the examples, which all of which pretty much involve an investigation, but we want to focus on what an investigation is and how it proceeds, how to carry it out. Okay, so we'll see if we get to that, but let's start with the case of the scratched car. It's a very mundane example. It's not a plane crash or anything, a motel explosion. It's just a little story of somebody coming out of their house in the morning and seeing a scratch on their car. So let's see how it goes. It's on page 177. The wind woke me from a sound sleep at about 4 a.m. I could hear it howling through the trees and pelting the bedroom window with bits of debris. In the morning, when I tried to dispose of some kitchen scraps, our large metal garbage can was not in its usual spot next to the garage. I finally found it wedged under a bush on the other side of my car, which had been parked in the driveway. The car itself had new scrapes and scratches just about the height of a rolling garbage can on the side facing the can's normal location. So, one thing about this passage is if you were to just read this and not as an example for, the sorts of concepts we're trying to learn, it would just sound like a description, a narration of some things that happened to me this morning, right? If somebody said, "Well, what's the argument of this passage?" You might be like, "Argument? Is this person trying to convince us of anything? Are they arguing for some claim that they're supporting with premises?" And maybe they're not. So maybe the author is not intending to give an argument. But remember, the whole time we've been using argument and inference mostly interchangeably. So whether you're consciously, self-consciously giving an argument and defending a claim by providing support for it, or if you're just thinking to yourself in your head and making an inference from one thought or one set of thoughts to another, that can be called an argument from some premises to a conclusion that you're doing subconsciously. And that's what we see here. And so when the author of the passage isn't self-consciously giving an argument, a lot of times um, the conclusion might be implicit. Maybe some of the premises are implicit. So we've got to do some, digging in order to schematize an argument and- that's sort of buried within this passage. We've got to find the premises and the conclusion. So the conclusion specifically here is pretty much unstated. But what do you think the person who's seeing this happen, the author of the passage, who's like walking out of their house and looking at all this, what are they starting to infer? In a way they don't quite make the inference, but it seems like they are about to, right? So what's the conclusion that they're about to draw here based on all that? Let's see if you can get that first. Well, hopefully you had a second to think about it, but the conclusion here seems to be that the trash can scratched and scraped the car, right? The car had new scrapes and scratches. That's something unfortunate. That's something that most people are not gonna like to see. And it's something that you might want to know why why that happened, how that happened, right? So we also can come up with the implicit question if the conclusion is the can scratched the car, then what question does that answer? Try to come up with that. Well, the question would just be what scratched the car? Okay. So, yeah, what question might the author want to answer? So you could first come up with the conclusion and then the implicit question, or in the other order. So on the slides, I first ask, what question are they maybe trying to answer? They're trying to think of, hey, what scratched the car here? Okay. And then their answer, even though it's completely implicit, seems to be the garbage can scratched the car. Why is that their conclusion? Well, because they've noticed a lot of things that support it. So, what's the support? What are the premises? Well, yeah, so why do they think the garbage can scratched the car? Well, it was moved. It was not in its usual spot. It was on the other side of my car, so it had somehow been, presumably blown by the wind and it had made its way around the car. Okay, it could have easily scratched the car while it was, taking its journey. And the car had these scrapes and scratches, and those scrapes and scratches, we get some important details here. They are just about the height of a rolling garbage can. This is not a rolling garbage can, but this is sort of what I'm picturing. Um, since they do say it's a metal garbage can, I don't know if I've ever seen a metal rolling garbage can. Usually the rolling ones are plastic, but whatever. Okay. And so it's just about the height. So like maybe the lid of the can is a little bit wider, and that's what hit the car and scratched it. And the can, the scrapes and scratches are on the side facing the can's normal location. So we could sort of imagine, we're piecing together what maybe happened in the middle of the night. The can at its normal location, gets blown against the car, scratching it, and then falls down and starts rolling and rolls around to the bush on the other side. So we have a pretty good idea that that's most likely what happened. And of course, all of this is being inferred. That the whole story that I just told is inferred from the aftermath that we are directly perceiving, right? Okay. So let's list the support that we just listed. So there were heavy winds last night. We should definitely mention that. That's sort of what allows for all of that stuff to happen. If there weren't winds, the can wouldn't have moved all around the car, right? The can was found under a bush instead of its normal location. The can is made of metal. That seems important because otherwise it might not have been able to scratch the car. The car had new scrapes and scratches. That's going to be the premise that raises the implicit question of what scratched the car. The damage to the car is at the height of the garbage can, and it's on the side facing the can's normal location. We probably could lump 5 and 6 together. Okay, good. So lots of support. So again, even though they don't, I say their conclusion, even though they don't draw the conclusion, given that all these things are being stated, it seems like their mind is going to infer the conclusion whether they intend to or not, right? Okay, so what about rivals? What are some other possible answers? We might think, oh, of course it was the garbage can, right? Look at all that support that we had. Let's look at the support. A lot of the support specifically is about the can, S2, S3, S5, and S6, right? So like what else could it have been? So give it some thought. Think, you can think about things that do that, some other, maybe you can find one that's supported by some of those premises, and then maybe just come up with some that aren't necessarily supported by the premises, but could be true, could be plausible anyway. Some other things that could scratch the car, right? So after you've had a chance to do that, let's see what I've got here. Well, I think the second best candidate here is probably going to be some other object that was also blown by the wind, right? So, just an accident caused by the storm. Some other object than the can scratched the car. Okay. Or if it wasn't related to the wind blowing something, then what else could it have been? Well, it could have been not an accident, but intentional. Maybe somebody did it. Maybe it was a vandal, right? Somebody keyed my car because I, cut them off. And so out of road rage, they followed me home. And when I went inside, they came out and scratched my car. I don't know, right? So that'll be a vandal just means any, human being that intentionally scratched the car, right? What else could it have been? If it's, not some object accidentally blown by the wind, if it's not a human being doing it intentionally, well, maybe an animal. Animals can scratch things. Maybe, the neighborhood cats or raccoons were climbing all over my car. Who knows, right? And I think I've got one more here. Maybe even though they say the car had new scrapes and scratches, there's always the chance that they maybe didn't notice them until now. Okay, for whatever reason, maybe there was a collision while driving at some earlier date, maybe just, earlier that day. Maybe I accidentally like scraped up against something, didn't really notice it or didn't think that it caused any damage, and then forgot about that, right? Okay, so we've got some good rivals here. Maybe you came up with some other ones that I didn't think of. That would be good. All right, so what do we want to do next? We want to rank the rivals, right? So let's assume that these are all serious rivals. None of them seem outlandish or far-fetched or totally implausible, right? So let's rank them and let's evaluate the argument. And right now, evaluate just means say whether it is sound or not. Remember, sound means um, that the author's conclusion is at the top of our ranking, that we basically agree that the author has the best answer to the question, right? So give yourself a chance to do your ranking, and then we'll see what I've got. So I put it like this. I put the author's conclusion on top. Seems like a lot of stuff is pointing to the garbage can. That deserves to be on the top. Some other windblown object, I put that next just because it does take into account the premise of there being a big violent windstorm, right? And then I put animal above vandal just because what are the chances that somebody, how often do you have like an enemy that is going to vandalize your car? Um, um, you know, that just seemed less likely. Animals, maybe, we would need to know more, of course, in order to really rank these. And then I put C5 last because it does go against one of the things that's stated. Usually we should trust the author of the passage that they're giving us accurate factual information. If they say the car had new scrapes and scratches, unless we have some reason to doubt that they're right about that, we should just assume that they're right about that. That's part of reading charitably. And so, yeah, I think they would probably have noticed if there was an collision. Sorry for the slight typo there. So I put that one last. Okay. But yeah, I could see, 3 and 4, maybe you could switch those. Um, but yeah, I think it should look something like this. And so it is, in fact, a sound argument, right? According to us, the evaluators, we think the author has done a good job of giving the best answer to this question of what scratched the car. What else did we do? Well, last time we talked about relevance of support. So you can look at each piece of support, which is listed on the previous slide, and say how it affects the ranking. So whenever I ask you to articulate the relevance of support, that's Larry's way of saying to state how a given premise affects the ranking. Which conclusions does it raise in the ranking? Which ones does it lower? Does it do anything else? So let's first look at premise S1 that there were heavy winds last night. Which rivals, which conclusions is that relevant to, either in a positive supporting way or a negative, like undermining sort of way? So the fact that there were heavy winds last night, obviously that supports C1. The garbage can would not have moved if there weren't winds. So in fact, you might even say if there weren't heavy winds last night, C1 would be much lower in the ranking. Um, well, let's see. Now I'm starting to think of complications that I hadn't thought of before. So if there weren't winds last night, obviously there was other premises that support the garbage can still. The fact that it's on the other side of the car would that itself would raise a new question. How did the garbage can get there if there weren't heavy winds? And then it starts looking, oh, maybe a vandal scratched my car by throwing the garbage can against it. If we wanted to consider that possibility, we would have to rewrite these rivals because then C1 and C3 would overlap. So C1 right now means the garbage can scratched it with no human intervention, right? Basically blown by the wind. So if we want to include maybe a vandal used the garbage can, that would be one rival, and then a vandal used something else would be another rival, right? Okay, so that could get more complicated. But basically, C1, S1, there were heavy winds last night, raises C1 in the ranking. It also raises C2, of course, because that's saying some other object blown by the wind. In fact, C2, unlike C1, is only being supported by S1. And if you take away S1, then there's no reason to think that some object could have been blown by the wind if there were not heavy winds. So we would say S1 actually puts C2 on the ranking in the first place. It makes it a serious rival. Without S1, C2 would not be a serious rival, right? So without it, C2 wouldn't even be on the list. So that's how you would articulate the relevance of S1. Okay. Did you notice, I didn't mention it, but did you notice the little dot, dot, dot that I put here? I've mentioned that before, but we haven't seen an example of that. That's what I would call a gap in the ranking. So the vertical ellipsis between C1 and C2, by three dots is called an ellipsis, if you didn't know. That means that C1 we're considering it significantly more plausible than C2. It's not just more plausible, but it's a lot more plausible. Again, that's because there's so much information, so much support for the garbage can rival compared to any of the other rivals, right? Maybe you think that C2 is significantly more plausible, so some other windblown object is significantly more plausible than 3, 4, and 5, in which case you could put a gap beneath that one as well, right? Um, so what this means is when you're talking about relevance of support, you can talk about raising or lowering rivals in the ranking. You can also talk about the gaps. So let's say some new information became known that lowered C1 or raised C2. Maybe it wouldn't switch their places, but it could close the gap. That's something else that a certain piece of support could be that could be its relevance, right? So I can't think of a case like that right now, or can I? Let's see. Um, if something helped C2, so if there was some other windblown object, I think I'm going to give an example of this pretty soon, that was like, that had other things going for it, but maybe not as much as it can, that might close the gap between C1 and C2. I think we're going to see an example of that, okay? Um, but what this means is if there's a gap, if you actually want to get C2 to overtake C1, you would need stronger than usual evidence for C2 or against C1. Okay. And by the way, the word evidence, I haven't used that as much as I probably should. It's another word that basically means support or premises. Okay. So when we're looking for new or just sometimes we say we're looking for new information, right? If new information, notice the color coding. I should have color coded evidence in the same red as information, support, premises, right? Um, anyway, so yeah, we can talk about instead of saying the relevance of a piece of support is that it raises this and lowers this, we can just say it more simply. A certain piece of evidence is evidence for a certain rival or it's evidence against another rival. Okay. So we can talk that way as well. All right, well, let's keep going with the case. Let's articulate the relevance of the other premises. So how about S2, the fact that the garbage can was found under a bush instead of in its normal location? Give yourself a chance to try to articulate the relevance there. Oh, sorry. Let's look at all of them. Okay, here they are. Okay. C2, C3, sorry, S2, S3, S5, and S6. Okay. So as I said, all of these do what? Well, they all support the author's conclusion. They all raise C1 in the ranking. And it's because of this sort of overwhelming amount of evidence that points towards the garbage can. That's why there's a gap between it and the other rivals. Okay. How about just the fact that the car had new scrapes and scratches? That's S4. That's the premise that raises the implicit question. Maybe I shouldn't use the word raise because we're talking about raising rivals in the ranking. Triggers the question. Is that okay? So a question can be triggered by something that is, that makes us wonder, to go back to the very first lecture of the course. When we see something that makes us wonder, we start thinking, we start asking questions about why it is the way that it is, right? We see those scratches and we're wondering what caused those. Then we get our implicit question. So this is the one that triggers the implicit question. Oftentimes, if you think about it, all of the rivals are trying to answer the implicit question. So what if there's a premise that triggers the question, it's going to be relevant to all of the rivals usually. Okay? So this, like I say, this premise is different from all the others since it essentially supports them all equally. Indeed, the scrapes and scratches are what made the IQ arise in the first place. Without this, there would be no argument, no rivals, no ranking. And we'll say more about this kind of support in I should have said chapter 5. When we get to chapter 5 of Larry's book, we'll be focusing on, we'll have a name for this kind of premise, but we'll get to that later. Okay. All right. So that one, it supports them all equally. It doesn't like raise one of them above the others or anything like that. How about some new information? So here I put the brief descriptions of the rivals so that we can remember what they are instead of just having numbers. So this is our original ranking where we had premises S1 through S6. Now this is getting into the idea of an investigation. Let's suppose that new information comes to light. That's what we often say when an investigation makes progress. New information has come to light, new evidence has been found, new support is available, right? And so let's say we find out at 7 that there's a streak of car-colored paint, whatever color my car is, there's a streak of that color of paint on a nearby lawn chair. Hmm, that's suspicious, right? That seems relevant. How is it relevant? Let's articulate the relevance of S7 and provide a new ranking if it changes the ranking. Well, what do you think? What would that do? Well, if it was the lawn chair, do we even have that on our in our rivals? Well, sort of. We have C2, which is some other windblown debris, right? Presumably, if the lawn chair did it, it was also blown by the wind, just like we're imagining for the garbage can. So what should we do? Should we just keep should we just raise C2 in the ranking? Well, the fact that we now have a specific second suspect, we might want to single it out and not just have it be part of this bigger category of wind-blown objects. So this suggests we should split. I guess I made these slides several years ago. Oh my gosh, that's very long ago. Apparently there was a big storm in 2016. I don't even remember. That was a meme that got sent around. Anyway, this suggests that the chair, not the can, was blown by the wind into the car. Presumably the can doesn't have the paint and the chair does. So that makes the chair a pretty serious rival. So this suggests we should split C2. That's another thing. If you go back to the last lecture, I listed different ways in which a premise can be relevant. It can raise or lower rivals. It can affect the gaps between the rivals. It can put rivals on or off the list of serious rivals, or it can split or lump rivals either apart or together. Okay, so here we're going to split C2 into what we would call C2A and C2B. You could just give them new numbers, I guess, but this shows that they came from this registers the fact that they came from splitting C2 into two different, more specific versions of wind-blown debris. So we'll say C2A is the lawn chair was what scratched the car, and C2B will still be the rest of the objects that could have been blown by the wind. So C2B will now be wind-blown debris other than the can or the chair. Okay? So it splits it, but it doesn't just split it and keep them like in the same place. It puts C2A certainly higher than C2B, right? So we have reason to think it was the chair rather than other things. And perhaps it would even close the gap between C1 and C2A. So maybe it looks like this now. So here's we call this a dynamic argument or an investigation where the ranking changes, right? We're looking not just at a fixed, snapshot of here's all the information we've got, as if that's all the information we're ever going to have, and here's the ranking that it creates. No, things change. If we add premise S7, that affects the ranking. It doesn't affect 4, 3, and 5, but it does what I said. It splits C2, and I would say it closes the gap because that paint is, pretty good evidence that the chair came in contact with the car. Does it put it above the can? Well, in a way, there's maybe still a little bit more evidence for the can. The fact that it, is the right height, that it moved. We also don't know the can is made of metal. If the lawn chair is made out of plastic, that might make it less likely. In fact, plastic could potentially hit the car, pick up some paint, but not really leave much of a scratch. Maybe just like a scuff, like a little like streak or something. But scrapes and scratches was how it was described. So if the chair, depending on what the chair is made out of, that would affect C1 and C2A. Maybe you think that they should be tied at this point. That would be another possibility. Okay. And maybe you think there should be a gap between C2A and everything below it. In fact, I would probably want to put that there. Maybe I didn't have enough room. But yeah, those are some other ways you could do the ranking. Okay. Let's do two more. So what if we find that there's no paint on the garbage can? So if we specifically, once we see the paint on the chair, we look at the can, we're like, oh, if the can scratched it, surely there would be something matching, like on the rim of the lid or whatever it's like the part that would make contact, we should look for paint there. Let's say we don't find any. Well, that certainly would raise C2. It would lower C1 and therefore raise C2A, the lawn chair rival. Perhaps it goes above C1 at this point, right? We were sort of already thinking of it that way because we didn't, there was no mention of paint on the garbage can, but now that we've confirmed that there's none, maybe that's the decisive thing that puts the chair above the can. Okay, but again, I think maybe we would still want a gap between them and everything else. So like they're the really serious ones. Those are like our leads that we're pursuing in our investigation, and these are sort of like, backup suspects. Okay. And then how about this? The chair is in its usual spot, standing up, unlike the can, which is fallen down and on the other side of the car. Well, now C2A hardly even seems serious. It went from the most serious, the most plausible rival to almost completely implausible. How could it have scratched the car and then return to its spot and not even be knocked over? Right? I mean, of course, if it's now, we might want to know how close is it to the car. It would be good to have like a picture of the scene here. If it's close enough, then yeah, maybe it got like blown against and then came right back. But if it's like, even just like 6 feet away, in order to be blown against the car, like it would probably fall down and it's not going to return to its original spot. There's some sort of like, thermodynamic, law of entropy here that would say that would be a very unlikely thing to happen for order to be reestablished by chaos, right? Okay, so I think at this point we would probably just lump C2A back together with C2B, taking us back to the original ranking. And maybe the paint on the chair is either a coincidence or maybe that's something that happened earlier that I didn't notice. When I bought the chair, I brought it out of the car, accidentally scuffed my car, and then put it over somewhere else, and it's had that paint on it for a while, right? Maybe that's how we would explain that. Okay, so let's see. I think I'll save this for the next lecture. So investigations will be our focus in the next lecture, but I'll leave it at that for now. All right, see you then.